All right, get ready because today we're going deep, a deep dive into this really fascinating world of sensation and perception. We're going to unpack how our brains take in all the info from the world around us and turn it into, our own unique experiences.
Sounds fun.
And our guide for this journey is excerpts from the ninth edition of Psychology by David G. Myers,
Okay.
focusing mainly on vision and hearing.
I think what's really cool about this deep dive is we're not just talking about biology.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about how our brains actually construct our reality.
Yeah. It's like our senses are providing the raw materials,
Yeah,
and our brains are the master architects building this perception of the world.
it's true.
So let's start with vision. One thing that it always blows my mind is how much brain power goes into like recognizing faces.
Yeah. It's truly remarkable. The textbook mentions that a full 30% of the cortex is dedicated to processing faces, which is 10 times the area
Mhm.
devoted to hearing.
Oh.
That level of neural real estate, I mean, it suggests just how essential facial recognition is to us as a species.
Why do you think that is? Is it purely for identification or is there something more to it?
Well, think about the evolutionary advantages.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to quickly recognize friend from foe, or even just to read subtle emotional cues on someone's face. I mean, that would have been crucial for survival and social interaction, way back when.
Right.
And it might explain why we're so drawn to faces like from infancy,
Yeah.
and why even subtle disruptions in facial recognition can have such a profound impact on our social lives.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about knowing who someone is.
Right.
It's about understanding their intentions, their emotions.
Yeah.
That's like a whole other level of communication happening through facial expressions.
Totally.
And it's all thanks to our brains dedicating this huge chunk of processing power to it.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, what would happen if we could somehow harness that processing power for other tasks? Like, whoa.
That's a fascinating thought. Imagine if we could apply that level of detail and attention to, other forms of information processing.
Right.
But for now, let's stick with exploring how our brains tackle vision. Another fascinating aspect is how the brain processes different aspects of vision simultaneously using something called parallel processing.
Okay, break that down for me. Does that mean our brain is multitasking when it comes to seeing?
Exactly. It's not like our brain is saying, okay, let's finish analyzing the color first and then move on to motion.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it's processing color, motion, form, depth, all at the same time.
Wow.
It's like having these specialized teams of neurons all working on different aspects of the visual scene and then somehow integrating all that information into this seamless perception.
So it's not just one big picture being formed, it's all these like smaller pictures being stitched together incredibly fast.
Precisely. And this parallel processing, it isn't just limited to vision. It's a fundamental principle of how our brains work in general. It's how we can walk and talk at the same time or drive a car while listening to music.
Man, it's making me realize just how much is happening beneath the surface of our awareness. Speaking of things happening beneath the surface, the textbook mentions this phenomenon called blind sight, which seems like a glitch in the matrix of our visual processing.
It really is. Blindsight is one of those discoveries that really challenges our understanding of what seeing actually means. Um, Imagine this. Someone has damage to their visual cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing sight. So you'd expect them to be blind, right?
Yeah, that's what I would assume, yeah.
But here's the thing. They can still react to visual stimuli even though they're not consciously aware of seeing them.
Hmm.
They might reach for an object in their blind spot or even accurately guess its shape or orientation, all while insisting that they can't see a thing.
So are they actually seeing, or is it something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question. Blind sight suggests that there are multiple pathways for visual information to reach the brain. So while the conscious pathway might be damaged, there might be these other subconscious pathways still operating. It's like this hidden visual track that we're only just beginning to understand.
This is getting deep. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we perceive color. It's something we take for granted, but it's a really complex process.
Yeah, the biggest misconception is that color is like an inherent property of objects. But in reality, objects don't actually possess color.
Wait, are you saying a red apple isn't actually red?
Not in the way we typically think.
Yeah.
What we perceive as color is our brain's interpretation of different wavelengths of light being reflected off an object.
Oh, okay.
So that apple is reflecting wavelengths that our brains then translate into the experience of red.
So color is more of a mental construct than a physical property. That's wild.
It is pretty wild.
But how does the brain actually pull off this color creation magic?
Well, there are a couple of key theories that attempt to explain this. The first is the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, which proposes that we have three types of color receptors in our retinas. One for red, one for green, and one for blue.
Like those primary colors we learned about in art class.
Exactly. When these receptors are stimulated in different combinations, we perceive the full spectrum of colors. It's like mixing paints, but with light.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing it's not the whole story.
You're right. The trichromatic theory doesn't explain everything about color vision, like why we see certain colors as opposites, like red and green or blue and yellow.
Right.
To understand that, we need to look at the opponent process theory.
Intriguing. What does this opponent process theory propose?
It suggests that our visual system analyzes color in terms of these opposing pairs, red versus green, yellow versus blue, and black versus white, and these pairs inhibit each other.
Okay.
So when one is activated, the other is suppressed.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following. Can you give me like a real-world example?
Sure. Have you ever stared at a red image for a while and then looked at a white surface?
Yeah, I think I've done that before.
You probably saw like a greenish after image.
Right.
That's because you fatigues the red receptors. So when you looked at white, which contains all colors, the opponent green receptors were more active, creating that ghostly green image.
Oh, that's so cool. It's like a little sneak peek into the inner workings of our visual system. So our brains aren't just passively receiving color information, they're actively creating our perception of color through this opponent process dance.
Precisely. And this interplay of theories helps us understand how our brains take something as fundamental as light and transform it into, this vibrant tapestry of colors that we experience every day.
I am officially mind blown. We've covered so much ground already, from facial recognition to color perception, and this is just vision? What about our other senses? Like, how do we perceive the world through sound?
That's a great question, and it takes us on a whole new journey into the inner workings of the ear. But first, we need to understand that sound, unlike light, is a mechanical wave. It travels as vibrations through a medium, like air.
So it's like a ripple effect, but with air molecules instead of water.
That's a good way to visualize it.
Yeah.
These vibrations create waves of compressed and expanded air molecules, and those waves are what our ears pick up.
Okay, walk me through how these air waves get transformed into something our brains can understand as sound.
Get ready for an adventure through the intricate machinery of the human ear. It all starts with the outer ear, which acts like a funnel, collecting those sound waves and channeling them through the auditory canal to the eardrum.
So the outer ear is like the first stage of this auditory pipeline.
Exactly. As those sound waves hit the eardrum, they cause it to vibrate. And these vibrations are then passed on to three tiny bones in the middle ear. The malleus, the endulcus, and the stapes.
Oh, I remember learning about those in school. Didn't they have like more common names?
They did. The malleus is also known as the hammer, the incus is the anvil, and the stapes is the stirrup.
Okay, I see where those names come from. They really do look like those tools. But what's their purpose in the ear?
They're not just there for looks. These bones form a delicate chain that amplifies the vibrations coming from the eardrum and transmits them to the cochlea, which is a fluid-filled, snail-shaped structure in the inner ear.
So these tiny bones are like a built-in amplifier, boosting the signal before it reaches the inner ear. Pretty ingenious. What happens in the cochlea? Is that where the sound gets translated into neural signal?
You got it. The cochlea is where the real magic happens. As the vibrations travel through the fluid in the cochlea, they create waves that ripple along this special membrane called the basilar membrane. And lining this membrane are thousands of tiny hair cells.
Hair cells? Are those like the ones we have on our heads?
Not quite. These hair cells are incredibly sensitive sensory receptors. As the fluid waves cause the basilar membrane to vibrate, these hair cells get bent, and that triggers neural impulses that are sent to the brain via the auditory nerve.
So those tiny hair cells are the key to converting those mechanical vibrations into something our brain can understand as sound. That's incredible. Are those the same hair cells that can be damaged by loud noises?
Yes. Unfortunately, these hair cells are very delicate and susceptible to damage from loud noise exposure.
Huh.
And once they're damaged, they don't regenerate, which is why, hearing loss is often irreversible.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective. Protecting our hearing is clearly essential given how delicate and intricate this whole system is.
Absolutely. And it gets even more mind-boggling when you consider just how sensitive these hair cells are. Did you know that deflecting a hair cell cilia by the width of an atom is enough to trigger a neural response?
The width of an atom, seriously.
It's mind-boggling, right? To put that into perspective, it's like displacing the top of the Eiffel Tower by half an inch. That's how sensitive our hearing system is. It's picking up on the most minute vibrations in the air.
Wow, talk about amazing feats of engineering. Our ears are truly remarkable instruments. But before we get too carried away praising our ears, let's not forget about our other senses. We've explored vision and hearing, but what about touch, taste, and smell? Don't they play just as important a role in shaping our experience of the world?
They absolutely do. While vision and hearing might dominate our conscious awareness, touch, taste, and smell are just as crucial to our perception, our emotions, and our overall well-being. Let's start with touch. It's not just about feeling textures. It's a much richer and more complex sense than we often give it credit for.
I'm ready to dive into the world of touch. Tell me, what makes this sense so special?
Well, touch is essential for our development,
Hmm.
our emotional connection, even our survival. Studies have shown that infants deprived of touch, they suffer greatly. They show signs of distress, delayed development, and they have difficulty forming healthy attachments.
That's a powerful example. It makes me realize how much we take for granted the simple act of touch. So how does this sense actually work? What's going on beneath the surface of our skin?
We have a vast network of touch receptors distributed throughout our skin, and these receptors respond to a variety of stimuli, including pressure, temperature, and pain.
So each type of receptor is specialized for a specific type of sensation.
Exactly. Some receptors are highly sensitive to light touch, while others respond to deep pressure. We have receptors that detect warmth and others that detect cold. And of course, we have nociceptors, which are responsible for our perception of pain.
Pain is such a fascinating and complex sensation. It's not just physical, is it? There's definitely like a psychological component as well.
You're absolutely right. Our perception of pain is influenced by a whole host of factors,
Hmm.
including our expectations, our mood, our past experiences, and even our cultural background.
So if I'm anticipating something to be painful, it might actually hurt more.
Exactly. Our brains can amplify or dampen pain signals based on, what we expect to feel. And there's also this fascinating phenomenon called phantom limb sensations, where people who have lost a limb can still feel sensations, even pain, in the limb that's no longer there.
Phantom limb pain, that sounds a little spooky.
It is a bit eerie. It highlights just how powerful the brain's role is in our experience of touch and pain. Our brains can create sensations even in the absence of physical input.
Okay, I'm definitely filing that under things that make you go, hmm. Let's move on to taste and smell. These senses are often like lumped together, and I'm curious to know why.
They're closely linked because they both involve detecting chemicals in the environment.
Yeah.
But while taste is limited to the 5 basic tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, our sense of smell is capable of detecting thousands of different odor molecules.
5 basic tastes versus thousands of smells. It seems like smell has like a much bigger range.
It does. And smell plays a much larger role in our experience of flavor than we often realize. In fact, much of what we perceive as taste is actually due to our sense of smell. Try holding your nose while eating something, and you'll see how much smell contributes to the overall taste experience.
I'm definitely going to try that. It makes me wonder, why are smell and taste so intertwined?
Well, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Smell helps us identify food sources from a distance, while taste provides a more detailed analysis of the food once it's in our mouths. This combination helps us determine whether something is safe and nutritious to eat or potentially harmful.
So our sense of smell is like the scout, scanning the environment for potential food, and taste is the quality control inspector making sure it's good to go.
That's a great analogy. And this interplay between smell and taste is just one example of how our senses work together to create this rich and multi-layered experience of the world.
This is making me think about how our brains take in all this sensory information and somehow manage to organize it into this coherent perception of the world. Is there a framework for understanding how this happens?
There is. And it's called Gestalt psychology, which emphasizes that we perceive the world as organized wholes, not just a collection of individual parts. It's the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
So it's like looking at a painting. We don't just see individual brushstrokes, we see the overall image, right?
Exactly. And Gestalt psychologists have identified a number of principles that explain how we group sensory information together to create these meaningful perceptions.
Tell me more about these principles. How do they help us make sense of, the sensory world?
One of the most fundamental principles is the figure-ground relationship, which is how we distinguish an object, the figure, from its background, the ground. Think about looking at a tree against the sky. The tree is the figure and the sky is the ground.
Okay, that makes sense. What other principles are there?
There's proximity, where we tend to group things together that are, close to each other. There's similarity, where we group things that are alike in appearance. And there's continuity, where we perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. And then there's closure, where we tend to, fill in gaps to create complete objects.
So if I see a circle with a small gap in it, my brain is likely to perceive it as a complete circle rather than just an arc.
Precisely. These Gestalt principles are constantly operating in the background, helping us to organize the sensory chaos into a meaningful and coherent perception of the world.
It's amazing how much our brains are doing behind the scenes that we're not even aware of. And speaking of things we're not aware of, I'm remembering all those optical illusions that play tricks on our perception. Do those tie into Gestalt principles at all?
Absolutely. Optical illusions are a fascinating way to illustrate how our brains actively construct our perceptions. They take advantage of these Gestalt principles to create images that trick our brains into seeing things that aren't really there, or not seeing things that are.
Do you have a favorite illusion that exemplifies this?
One of the classics is the Necker cube. It's a simple line drawing of a cube, but it can be perceived in two different ways, with the front and back faces reversing. It's a great example of how the same visual stimulus can lead to multiple interpretations depending on how our brain decides to organize, the figure-ground relationship.
It's like our brain is constantly making choices about how to interpret the information it's receiving.
Exactly. Our brains aren't just passively recording the world. They're actively constructing our perceptions based on the incoming sensory information and our existing knowledge, expectations, and even our cultural background.
So it's like our brains are constantly building a model of the world, using our senses as the input and our past experiences as the blueprint.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it.
And sometimes those models can be tricked, leading to to those mind-bending illusions.
That's true.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm afraid we've run out of time for this segment. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into sensation and perception, where we'll explore how our brains make sense of depth, motion, and even the influence of culture on our perceptions. Welcome back to our deep dive into this amazing world of sensation and perception. Last time we explored how our brains turn light and sound into, the sights and sounds we experience every day. But there's so much more to our sensory repertoire than just those two senses, right?
Absolutely. We have a whole suite of senses that work together to give us this rich and multifaceted understanding of the world. And some of them, like our sense of balance and body position, operate largely behind the scenes without us even realizing how much we rely on them.
That's a great point. I'm really curious to delve into those less obvious senses. Let's start with our sense of body position, or proprioception, as it's formally called. It's something we rarely think about, but it's crucial for just about everything we do.
It really is.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to walk or even just stand up without being able to sense where your limbs are in space.
Yeah.
It would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
Proprioception allows us to move gracefully and coordinate our actions, without having to consciously think about every muscle contraction.
It's like having an internal GPS for our bodies, constantly tracking where each part is and how it's moving.
That's a great analogy. And this internal GPS relies on a network of sensors located in our muscles, tendons, and joints. And these sensors provide feedback to the brain about the length, tension, and position of our limbs, allowing us to move smoothly and effortlessly.
So it's not just about knowing where our limbs are, but also about sensing like how much force we're using and how our muscles are stretching and contracting.
Exactly. It's this constant feedback loop between our brains and our bodies, allowing us to make adjustments on the fly and move with precision and control.
That makes sense. And what about our sense of balance? How does that fit into this intricate sensory system?
Her sense of balance or equilibrium is controlled by the vestibular system, which
Okay.
is located in the inner ear right next to the cochlea. Remember that snail-shaped structure we talked about in the last segment?
Yeah, the one with those super sensitive hair cells that convert sound vibrations into neural signals.
You got it. Those hair cells are multitasking marvels. In the vestibular system, they're embedded in these fluid-filled canals and chambers that detect changes in head movement and position.
So when I turn my head or tilt it up and down, those hair cells in the vestibular system are sensing those movements and sending signals to my brain.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the brain integrates this information with visual input from our eyes and proprioceptive input from our muscles and joints to help us, maintain our balance and spatial orientation.
It's like a three-way conversation happening between our eyes, our inner ears, and our muscles, all working together to keep us upright and steady. It's amazing how these different sensory systems cooperate to create this seamless experience of the world.
It really is. And this integration of sensory information, it goes beyond just balance and coordination. It influences how we perceive depth, motion, and even how we interact with objects in our environment.
Okay, I'm really intrigued now. How do our brains use sensory information to create those more complex perceptions? Let's start with depth perception.
Huh.
How do we see the world in three dimensions when our eyes only capture these two-dimensional images?
That's one of the great mysteries of perception. Our brains rely on a variety of depth cues to create, the illusion of three-dimensionality. Some of these cues require both eyes. We call those binocular cues, while others can be perceived with just one eye, known as monocular cues.
Can you give me some examples of these depth cues? I'm curious to know what tricks our brains are using.
Sure. One of the most important binocular cues is retinal disparity. Because our eyes are spaced apart, they each receive a slightly different image of the world.
It's like having two cameras taking pictures from slightly different angles, right?
Exactly. And our brain compares these two images, and the difference between them, known as disparity, provides information about the relative depth of objects. The greater the disparity, the closer the object appears.
That's so cool. So our brains are essentially doing some complex trigonometry to figure out how far away things are. What about those monocular cues you mentioned? How can we perceive depth with just one eye?
We use a whole arsenal of monocular cues. Some of the most common include relative size, interposition, linear perspective, texture gradient, and relative height.
Okay, those are a lot of new terms. Break those down for me.
Sure. Let's start with relative size. It's a pretty intuitive concept. Objects that are closer to us appear larger, while objects that are farther away appear smaller.
That makes sense. So if I see two trees and one looks much smaller than the other, I can assume that the smaller tree is farther away.
Exactly. Now let's talk about interposition. This cue refers to the fact that when one object partially blocks our view of another object, we perceive the blocked object as being farther away.
So if I see a tree in front of a house, I know the tree is closer to me because it's blocking part of the house.
You got it. Linear perspective is another powerful cue that artists often use to create a sense of depth in their paintings. Parallel lines, like railroad tracks, appear to converge as they recede into the distance, creating, the illusion of depth.
I've definitely noticed that in paintings, those converging lines really do like trick your eye into seeing depth. What about texture, gradient, and relative height? How do those work?
Sure, texture gradient refers to the way textures appear to become, denser and less detailed as they recede into the distance. Think about a field of grass. The blades that are closer to you will look more distinct and spread out, while the blades farther away will look more like this, solid green mass.
Okay, I can picture that. And relative height.
Relative height is a simple but effective cue. Objects that are higher in our visual field tend to be perceived as further away. This is why, things on the ground appear closer to us than things in the sky.
Wow. It's incredible how our brains use all these subtle cues to construct a three-dimensional world from these two-dimensional images. It's like our brains are constantly solving this complex visual puzzle, putting all the pieces together to create a seamless and coherent perception of depth.
It really is. And it's not just depth perception that our brains excel at. We're also remarkably good at perceiving motion, even though, motion itself isn't directly present in the sensory information we receive.
Okay, now you've really lost me. Explain that one. How can we perceive motion if it's not actually there in the sensory input?
Think about how a movie works.
Okay.
It's just a series of still images projected rapidly onto a screen. But our brains interpret these rapidly changing images as continuous motion.
Right. I know it's not really moving, but it sure looks like it is.
Exactly. And this illusion of motion is created by specialized neurons in our brains that
Mhm.
detect changes in light and shadow. These neurons are highly sensitive to movement, and they send signals to the brain that, trigger our perception of motion.
So our brains are essentially filling in the gaps, creating the illusion of motion from a series of static snapshots. It's like a flip book come to life.
That's a great way to put it. And this ability to perceive motion is crucial for our survival. It allows us to react quickly to moving objects, whether it's, a car speeding toward us or a predator approaching in the wild.
It's amazing how our brains take these fragmented bits of sensory information and weave them into this seamless and dynamic perception of the world. It's like our brains are constantly telling a story using our senses as the narrative thread.
That's a beautiful way to describe it. And this storytelling ability, goes beyond just processing basic sensory information. It involves drawing on our past experiences, our expectations, and even our cultural background to, shape how we interpret the world around us.
That's right. We talked about how culture influences our perception of color earlier. Are there other examples of how culture shapes our senses?
There are. For instance, studies have shown that people from different cultures might perceive depth in pictures differently. Those who come from cultures that rely heavily on two-dimensional representations, like paintings and drawings, might be less sensitive to some depth cues in three-dimensional scenes.
So someone from a culture with a strong tradition of visual art might interpret a photograph differently than someone from a culture that's more immersed in real world three-dimensional environments.
That's the idea. It suggests that our cultural background can actually shape how our brains process visual information. And this cultural lens can influence not only our visual perceptions, but also our perceptions of time, music, and even social interactions.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize how much of what we perceive as objective reality might actually be shaped by our cultural biases and assumptions. Our brains are constantly filtering and interpreting information through the lens of our own, unique experiences and cultural upbringing.
You've hit on a crucial point. Perception is not a purely objective process.
Hmm.
It's always influenced by this complex interplay of factors, including our individual experiences, our beliefs, and our cultural background. It's what makes our experience of the world so unique and so richly textured.
This is mind-blowing. It's like we're all living in slightly different realities shaped by our own, unique perceptual filters. And this is just scratching the surface. I'm already eager to hear what other perceptual surprises await us in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into sensation and perception. It's amazing to think about how much we've uncovered already, from the intricate workings of our eyes and ears to the subtle ways our culture shapes how we experience the world.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this vast and fascinating field. But before we wrap up, I think there's one more essential concept we need to explore: perceptual constancy.
Perceptual constancy. That sounds intriguing. I'm all ears.
Well, think about this: as we move through the world and objects move around us, the images they project onto our retinas are constantly changing.
Right.
A door looks different when it's open versus closed. A car looks smaller as it drives away. But we don't perceive these objects as constantly, morphing and changing shape and size.
That's true. I still see a door as a door, whether it's open or closed. And a car driving away doesn't suddenly seem like a miniature toy car.
So how does our brain achieve this stability in our perceptions?
That's where perceptual constancy comes in. It's our brain's remarkable ability to take into account all these, changing sensory inputs and adjust our perceptions accordingly. It's like our brain is saying, okay, I know the image on my retina is changing, but I understand that the object itself is remaining constant. So our brains are doing all this like behind the scenes work to maintain this stable and consistent view of the world.
Hmm.
That's incredible. It's like a built-in like reality stabilizer.
Exactly. And there are different types of perceptual constancy that help us make sense of the world. There's shape constancy, size constancy, and color constancy.
I'm curious to learn more about each of those. Let's start with shape constancy.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
Sure. Shape constancy is our ability to perceive an object as having the same shape, even though its image on our retina changes. As we view it from different angles. Think about looking at a coin.
Okay.
When you view it straight on, it looks perfectly round.
Right.
But as you tilt the coin, the image on your retina becomes more elliptical.
Right, but I still perceive the coin as being round, even though its shape on my retina is changing.
That shape constancy in action.
Mm.
Our brain understands that the coin is a three-dimensional object, and it adjusts our perception accordingly. It's like our brain is, rotating the object in our mind's eye to maintain a consistent perception of its shape.
That makes so much sense. It's like our brains are doing some internal 3D modeling to keep our perceptions stable. What about size constancy? How does that work?
Size constancy is similar to shape constancy. It's our ability to perceive an object as having the same size, even though its image on our retina gets smaller as it moves farther away.
Mm.
Think about a friend walking away from you.
Okay.
Their image on your retina gets smaller and smaller,
Yeah.
but you don't perceive them as shrinking.
Right, they just appear to be getting farther away. But how does our brain know the difference between an object that's actually shrinking and an object that's just moving farther away?
That's a great question. Our brain relies on a combination of depth cues and our knowledge of the world. We know that people don't just randomly, shrink and grow. So our brain integrates the information about the object's distance with its retinal image size to maintain a consistent perception of its size.
It's amazing how our brains are constantly integrating all this information to make sense of the world. And what about color constancy? How does that fit into the picture?
Color constancy is our ability to perceive an object as having the same color, even when the lighting conditions change. For example, a red apple will still look red to us, whether we're viewing it in bright sunlight or in dim indoor lighting.
Right.
Even though the wavelengths of light being reflected off the apple are different in these different lighting conditions, our brain adjusts our perception to maintain this consistent color experience.
So our brains are essentially compensating for the changes in lighting to keep our perception of color stable.
That's incredible. It makes me realize just how much work our brains are doing behind the scenes to create a seamless and coherent perception of reality.
It's like our brains are constantly running these complex algorithms, taking into account all sorts of factors to ensure that our perceptions remain stable and reliable. And this perceptual constancy is crucial for us to navigate the world effectively.
Mm.
Imagine if our perceptions were constantly changing based on every little variation in lighting or viewing angle. It would be a very confusing and disorienting experience.
I can't even imagine. It's like the world would be in this constant state of flux with objects morphing and changing before our very eyes. It makes me appreciate the incredible power of perceptual constancy to ground us in this stable and predictable reality. It's one of the unsung heroes of perception, for sure. And it highlights how our brains are not just passively receiving sensory information, but actively constructing our experience of the world. We're not just seeing what's out there. We're creating it in a sense through this intricate interplay of sensation, perception, and cognition.
This is making me think about all the ways our brains shape our reality beyond just these basic perceptual processes. We've talked about how culture influences our perceptions, but what about our individual experiences, our memories, our emotions? How do those factors play into our unique perceptions of the world?
That's a fascinating question.
Mm.
And it gets at the heart of what makes each of us see the world in a slightly different way. Our brains are like these incredible prediction machines, constantly anticipating what's going to happen next based on our past experiences and current sensory input.
So our perceptions are shaped not only by what's happening in the present, but also by what we've learned in the past and what we expect to happen in the future.
Exactly. And this predictive ability is what allows us to navigate the world so effortlessly and efficiently. We're not just reacting to stimuli. we're anticipating them, predicting them,
Huh.
and adjusting our behavior accordingly. It's what makes us such adaptable and resilient creatures.
This is also mind-blowing. It's like we're only just beginning to understand the true power and complexity of our own brains, and this deep dive into sensation and perception has really opened my eyes to the incredible ways our brains create our experience of reality.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's been a joy to explore this fascinating world with you,
Hmm.
and I hope this deep dive has sparked a sense of wonder and curiosity about your own perceptions. The world is full of sensory richness, just waiting to be discovered. All you have to do is pay attention.
This has been an incredible journey. We've covered so much ground from the intricate mechanisms of our senses to the mind-bending ways our brains shape our reality. It's been an absolute privilege to delve into this fascinating field with you. But for now, it's time to wrap up this deep dive into sensation and perception. I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as I have. And remember, the world is full of sensory wonders, just waiting to be explored. So go out there and keep those perceptions sharp.